Ethan Carter sat beside his mother's hospital bed, the steady beep of the monitor filling the silence. The room smelled of antiseptic and something heavier, the weight of time running out. His mother, Clara Carter, had always been strong. Even now, with dark circles under her eyes and an oxygen tube in her nose, she still managed a weak smile. "You're too young to worry like this," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan swallowed the lump in his throat. "Doctor says you need the surgery soon." Clara didn't respond, just turned her head toward the window. They both knew the truth, they couldn't afford it. Ethan glanced at the hospital bill crumpled in his fist. $35,000. More than he could ever make working 2 shifts at the diner. He clenched his jaw. There had to be a way. Ethan had never met Alexander Grant. The man had walked out before he was born, leaving Clara to raise him alone. And she never spoke of him, never showed anger, never mentioned his name. "It's just us, baby," she would say whenever Ethan asked. "That's all we need." But Ethan had needed answers. He had needed a father. And instead, he'd grown up hearing whispers about the billionaire mogul who ruled the business world while his mother worked 2 jobs just to keep food on the table. Ethan Carter didn't believe in fairy tales. He believed in survival. And Alexander Grant? He was just a name in a newspaper. A ghost with too much money and not enough heart. That night, Ethan sat at the diner waiting for his shift to start. His coworker, Liam, tossed a newspaper onto the counter. "Did you see this? Grant Enterprises is launching a new internship program. Full ride, crazy pay. Even nobodies like us can apply." Ethan's stomach twisted as he saw the bold headline. Grant Enterprises announces prestigious internship program for young entrepreneurs. His eyes scanned the article. The chosen interns would be mentored personally by Alexander Grant. His fingers tightened around the edges of the paper. Was this fate? A sick joke? Ethan hesitated. His mother had never wanted him to look for Grant. But she needed that surgery. And if Alexander Grant was the kind of man who could throw away a family without a second thought, then Ethan wouldn't feel guilty about taking whatever he could from him. He pulled out his phone and filled out the application. Name, Ethan Brooks. His mother's maiden name. A fake identity. Because if Alexander Grant wouldn't acknowledge him as a son, he would acknowledge him as a worthy opponent. With a deep breath, Ethan hit submit. The next morning, Ethan adjusted the cuffs of his only decent blazer, staring up at the towering glass fortress of Grant Enterprises. The sheer scale of the building made his stomach tighten. It wasn't just an office, it was a statement. The entire place reeked of power, from the spotless marble floors to the whisper-quiet elevators carrying billionaires to their kingdoms. He didn't belong here. For years, he had read about Alexander Grant, the ruthless billionaire who built an empire from the ground up, making headlines with every acquisition. But to Ethan, he wasn't just a business legend. He was the man who had abandoned his mother. The man who had never looked back. Ethan's fingers curled into fists. "He doesn't even know I exist." His reflection in the glass doors stared back, steady brown eyes, a strong jaw, his mother's features. He straightened his shoulders. This wasn't about emotion. It was about winning. For his mother. For himself. And maybe, just maybe, for revenge. The lobby of Grant Enterprises was all polished marble and steel, cold yet breathtakingly elegant. The air smelled like money, a blend of expensive cologne, fresh coffee, and the faint scent of leather briefcases carried by executives who had never struggled a day in their lives. Ethan forced himself to keep his head down as he joined a line of hopeful interns, all waiting for their turn. Some were nervously whispering, others scrolling through last-minute notes. He recognized a few faces, graduates from Ivy League schools dressed in designer suits that probably cost more than his entire rent. He swallowed hard. "You don't belong here." The thought slithered into his mind, but he crushed it. "I will make them see me." A tall, sharp-eyed woman in a black pencil skirt strode toward the group, a clipboard in hand. Next, Ethan Brooks. Ethan's pulse spiked. Showtime. The conference room was sleek and intimidating, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the city. A long glass table stretched across the space, occupied by a panel of interviewers, 5 in total. But Ethan only saw one man. Alexander Grant. Even in his late 50s, he commanded the room effortlessly. His suit was crisp, his silver-threaded hair neatly combed back. He looked exactly like the pictures Ethan had spent years hating. But pictures couldn't capture the sheer power that radiated from him. For a split second, Ethan froze. This is it. This is the man who left us. But Alexander Grant's steely gray eyes barely lingered on him. No recognition. No hesitation. Nothing. Ethan swallowed the lump in his throat. He really doesn't know who I am. The interview began. The questions came fast. What makes you the right candidate for this internship? Ethan steadied his voice. I'm adaptable. I think on my feet. And I don't quit. Tell us about a time you handled a high-pressure situation. Every day of my life. But he couldn't say that. Instead, he spoke about the time he helped the diner survive a sudden health inspection, managing the chaos while short-staffed. The panelists nodded, but Alexander Grant remained impassive. Then came the question Ethan had been dreading. Alexander leaned forward, fixing him with a piercing stare. "And what do you want from this company, Ethan Brooks?" For a moment, his mask nearly slipped. He wanted to say it. "I want to know why you left my mother. I want to make you regret it. I want to take everything from you, the way you took everything from her." But he couldn't. Instead, he locked his emotions away and answered carefully. "I want to learn from the best." A long pause. Then, something flickered in Alexander's eyes. Approval? Amusement? Suspicion? Ethan couldn't tell. Alexander sat back, his expression unreadable. The interview ended. "Thank you. We'll be in touch," one of the panelists said. Ethan exhaled, his heart still pounding as he rose from his seat. But just as he reached the door, a voice stopped him, deep, authoritative. "Alexander Grant." "Ethan." Ethan's entire body tensed. Slowly he turned. "Yes, sir?" For a moment, Alexander just studied him. Then, with an almost imperceptible tilt of his head, he said, "Good luck." Ethan forced himself to nod. "Thank you, sir." And then he walked out. His hands shook. Did Alexander feel something? A connection? A flicker of familiarity? No. He had looked at Ethan like a stranger, and somehow that burned more than Ethan had expected. For 2 days, Ethan felt like he was suffocating. Every second dragged by, filled with uncertainty. Then, on the evening of the second day, his phone buzzed. A single email. From Grant Enterprises Internship Program. "Congratulations, Ethan Brooks." His hands trembled as he read the words. "You have been selected as an intern at Grant Enterprises." Ethan exhaled sharply. He was in. This was it. The beginning. Ethan arrived early at Grant Enterprises, dressed in his cheap suit, feeling like an imposter among polished professionals. The glass skyscraper loomed over him, sleek and powerful, just like the man who owned it. This is it. No turning back now. His hands clenched at his sides as he stepped inside. The intern orientation room was filled with ambitious young candidates, all eager to prove themselves. Ethan felt out of place, but he wouldn't let it show. He had a mission, and the man he was after was somewhere in this building. The interns were ushered into a conference room where their mentors would be introduced. Ethan kept his expression neutral as Alexander Grant entered. The room stilled. He had that effect on people. Ethan watched as his father, the man who had walked away from him before he was even born, sat down at the head of the table. Alexander's presence was undeniable. His expensive suit was crisp, his posture commanding. Without sparing a glance at the interns, he adjusted his silver wristwatch, the movement so smooth it seemed unconscious. Ethan's stomach twisted. He knew that watch. His mother had once mentioned it in passing, saying it was the only personal item Alexander had ever truly valued. Said it reminded him of why he worked so hard. "Why?" Ethan had asked. "He never told me." Now, watching Alexander absently thumb the same watch, Ethan felt an unsettling stir in his chest. Names were called and mentors were assigned. Ethan's heart nearly stopped when he heard his own. "Ethan Brooks, Mr. Grant's division." A cold weight settled in his stomach. Of all the executives in this building, he had been placed directly under Alexander Grant. Ethan forced his breath to stay even as Alexander finally looked at him. "Mr. Brooks," Alexander said smoothly, "I expect you to work hard. Are you ready for this?" Ethan met his gaze, pulse pounding. "More ready than you think." "Yes, sir," he said. The work was relentless. Alexander Grant was a perfectionist. He demanded efficiency, precision, and results. Ethan spent late nights, buried in reports, trying to stay ahead. He memorized Alexander's methods, watching how he negotiated, how he led. And, to his frustration, he was actually learning. Despite everything, he couldn't deny it. Alexander was brilliant, but it didn't change the past. It didn't erase what he had done to Ethan's mother. No matter how much I learned from him, I won't forget why I'm here. One evening, Ethan stayed late to organize files in Alexander's office. He had just finished when the door opened. He turned quickly, only to freeze. Alexander Grant stood in the doorway, his usual controlled mask slightly cracked. His tie was loosened, his eyes tired. For the first time, he looked human. Ethan stood in silence as Alexander walked to his desk and sat down, rubbing his temples. He looked weighed down, burdened. It was a side of him the world never saw. Ethan had spent years hating this man. But now, for the first time, doubt crept in. Ethan turned to leave, but something on the desk caught his eye. A small leather book sat slightly open. Curiosity got the better of him. He leaned closer and saw something tucked inside. An old, faded photograph. Ethan's pulse stopped. It was his mother, younger, smiling. Her eyes filled with a happiness he had never seen in real life. And beside her, a younger Alexander Grant. They looked in love. Ethan's breath came in short, uneven gasps. Why does he still have this? After all these years, after abandoning them, did Alexander still think about her? Did he still regret? For the first time, Ethan's hatred wavered, and he didn't know what scared him more. The fact that his father might still care, or the fact that Ethan wasn't sure how he felt about it anymore. Just then, the office door clicked shut. Ethan whipped around. Alexander stood there, watching him. His sharp gaze flicked from the photograph to Ethan's face. And for the first time, he looked truly stunned. "What are you doing in here?" His voice was low, unreadable. Ethan's heart thundered. Had he just made a mistake? Had he just given himself away? Ethan swallowed hard, forcing himself to stay calm. "I was just finishing up some paperwork," he said evenly, stepping back from the desk. Alexander's sharp eyes flickered to the photo still lying on the desk. His expression hardened, his posture straightening. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, with a controlled movement, Alexander picked up the photograph and shut the book. "You shouldn't be snooping through my things," he said, his voice cold. Ethan's heart pounded. Did he suspect something? "I wasn't," he lied smoothly. "The book was open. I didn't mean to see anything." Alexander held his gaze for a long, tense second before nodding. "Go home, Brooks." Ethan hesitated but nodded. "Good night, sir." As he stepped out of the office, he exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. He had seen the look in Alexander's eyes, a flicker of something dangerous. Not anger, not irritation, something deeper. And Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that tonight he had gotten too close to something his father wasn't ready to confront. Ethan barely slept that night. The photo haunted him. If Alexander still kept it after all these years, what did that mean? Did he love her? Did he regret leaving? It was easier to hate Alexander Grant when Ethan thought he had abandoned them without a second thought. But what if? What if things weren't that simple? The next day, Ethan returned to work, determined to bury the doubts clawing at him. Alexander was already in the office, flipping through reports, his face unreadable. "Brooks," he said without looking up. "Follow me." Ethan tensed but obeyed, trailing him into the boardroom. Inside, a group of executives waited. "This is a business negotiation," Alexander said, handing Ethan a file. "I want you to observe how deals are made at this level. Pay attention." Ethan nodded, gripping the folder. For the next hour, he watched as Alexander dominated the room. His voice was calm, commanding, unwavering. Every counterargument, every hesitation from the opposing side was met with ruthless precision. Ethan couldn't deny it. The man was brilliant. He wasn't just wealthy, he was powerful. The meeting ended successfully and the executives left one by one. Ethan remained seated, watching as Alexander leaned back in his chair. For a brief moment, his mask slipped. He pinched the bridge of his nose, exhaling slowly. He looked tired, older. Forgetting himself, Ethan spoke. "Do you ever regret it?" Alexander's gaze snapped up, sharp as a blade. "Regret what?" Ethan hesitated, realizing his mistake. "Careful, Ethan." He shrugged, masking his emotions. "The sacrifices. Does it ever feel like it wasn't worth it?" Alexander studied him, his expression unreadable. Then, in a rare moment of honesty, he said, "There's always a cost, Brooks." A pause. "But once you've paid it, there's no going back." Ethan's stomach twisted. Was he talking about business? Or something else? That night, Ethan stayed late again, finishing work in the dimly lit office. As he was about to leave, he noticed Alexander standing by the window, gazing out at the city. For the first time, Ethan saw not the ruthless billionaire, but the man. A man who, for all his power, seemed completely alone. Ethan clenched his jaw. He had spent years hating this man. But tonight, For the first time, he wasn't so sure, and that terrified him. Ethan sat on the bus, his mind a chaotic mess. The city lights blurred past him, but all he could see was Alexander Grant's face, the cold, calculating man who had built an empire and left his mother behind. Or had he? The photo Ethan had found in his father's office refused to leave his mind. It complicated things. If Alexander truly never cared, why would he still have a picture of her? Was she more than just a fling? Did he ever look for us? The questions burned inside him, questions only one person could answer. His mother. Clara Carter looked smaller than usual in the hospital bed, her frail frame tucked beneath a thin blanket. The steady beep of the monitor was a constant reminder of why Ethan was doing all of this. For her. She stirred as Ethan sat down beside her. Her tired eyes softened the moment she saw him. "Baby," she murmured, giving him a weak smile. "You look exhausted." Ethan let out a breath, forcing a smirk. "You always say that." She reached out, brushing a hand over his face. "Because it's always true." For a moment, Ethan almost backed out. Almost pretended everything was fine. But he couldn't. Not after what he'd seen. Not after how close the truth felt. He gripped the arms of his chair and asked the one question he had avoided his entire life. "Mom, did Alexander Grant love you?" The smile faded from Clara's lips. Her fingers stilled on his cheek, and for the first time in years, she looked away. Ethan's stomach tightened. "You never talk about him," he said, voice lower now. "You always told me we didn't need him. And I believed you." Clara closed her eyes, exhaling. "You didn't need him." "That's not what I asked." A heavy silence fell between them. Then, after what felt like forever, she finally spoke. "I loved him," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "And for a while, I think he loved me too." Ethan's breath hitched. She never spoke about Alexander. Not like this. "What happened?" he asked, his throat dry. Clara sighed, sinking back into the pillow. "He was already building his empire when we met. But back then, he was different." She smiled faintly, lost in a memory. "Not soft, but not as ruthless as he is now. He had dreams, Ethan. And I believed in him." Ethan's chest tightened. He had always imagined Alexander as a cold-hearted businessman, a man who had never cared. But now his mother was telling him a different story. Clara's gaze turned distant. "When I got pregnant, everything changed." Ethan stiffened. "He left." She hesitated. "No." His breath caught. "He didn't." Clara closed her eyes. "He didn't know." Ethan's mind spun. "What?" he whispered. Clara looked at him now, pain in her tired eyes. "I never told him." Ethan shot to his feet, heart pounding. "You never told him?" Clara flinched, but she didn't deny it. Ethan staggered back, his whole world shifting. All these years, he had blamed Alexander for leaving. For abandoning them. But now he wasn't sure who had abandoned who. "Why?" Ethan demanded, his voice sharper than he intended. "Why didn't you tell him?" Clara sighed, looking down at her frail hands. "Because I was scared." "Of what?" "Of losing him." Ethan clenched his jaw. "That doesn't make sense, Mom. If he loved you, why wouldn't he have stayed?" She hesitated. Then, finally, "He was obsessed with his company, Ethan. Even back then. And I was afraid that if I told him, he'd choose it over us." Her voice broke. "So I made the choice first." Ethan felt like the ground had been ripped from beneath him. All these years. All the anger, all the resentment. Had been built on a lie. Or at the very least, a half-truth. He had spent his whole life hating a man who may have never even known he existed. Ethan sat back down, running a hand through his hair. His mother had lied, but he wasn't sure if he could blame her. She had made a choice out of fear. But so had Alexander. And now Ethan had to know if he had known about me, would he have stayed? He met his mother's gaze, determination hardening inside him. "I need to find out the truth," he said quietly. Clara swallowed. "Ethan, I have to." She didn't argue. Because deep down she knew. Ethan wouldn't stop until he had his answer. Gripping her frail hand as he forced a reassuring smile. "Mom, don't worry. I promise I'll get the money soon," he said firmly. Clara gave him a tired look, her fingers weakly squeezing his. "Ethan, I don't want you breaking yourself over this. I know how hard you're working." Ethan's throat tightened. If only she knew. The sleepless nights, the double shifts, the lies he had to keep straight. "Just focus on getting better," he said, brushing a strand of graying hair from her forehead. "That's all that matters." She sighed but didn't argue. Instead, she studied him with quiet concern. "Are you sure you're okay?" Ethan forced a chuckle. "I should be asking you that." She didn't laugh. "I mean it, Ethan." For a moment, the weight of everything pressed down on him. The long hours at the diner. The brutal internship at Grant Enterprises. The fact that his entire identity there was a lie. And now? Now, knowing his father had never abandoned them but had never been given the chance to stay? No. He was not okay. But he couldn't tell her that. Instead, he gave her the same reassuring look he always did. "I'm fine, Mom. I've got this." Clara exhaled, closing her eyes as if she wanted to believe him. "Just don't lose yourself, Ethan." Her words lingered as he stood, pressing a kiss to her forehead before heading for the door. By the time Ethan reached Grant Enterprises, exhaustion clung to him like a second skin. He had barely slept. Between his night shifts at the diner and the relentless work in the office, he was running on fumes. But he couldn't stop. Not when the stakes were this high. Not when his mother's life depended on it. Walking through the gleaming hallways of Grant Enterprises, he adjusted his tie and set his jaw. No one here could know the truth. He wasn't just an intern. He was Ethan Brooks, the ambitious young man who had earned a place in this elite program. Not Ethan Carter, the son Alexander Grant had never known existed. As he reached his desk, a voice jolted him back to reality. "You look like hell." Ethan turned to see Madeline Ross, one of the other interns. Smart, driven, and the only person in the program who seemed to almost like him. "Thanks, Maddie. You always know how to boost my confidence." She smirked, but concern flickered in her brown eyes. "Seriously, have you even slept?" Ethan shrugged, flipping open his laptop. "Not all of us have the luxury of beauty sleep." Madeline frowned but didn't push. "Well, get ready. We're being called into a strategy meeting." Ethan straightened. "With who?" She gave him a look. "Who do you think?" "Alexander Grant." His pulse quickened. Time to face his father again. Ethan sat stiffly in the conference room as Alexander Grant entered, commanding the space with his mere presence. Ethan had spent his whole life hating this man. Now he was working under him. And the worst part? Alexander was actually mentoring him. The meeting was intense, a deep dive into business strategy. Ethan expected to struggle, but to his surprise, he thrived. "You handled yourself well today," Alexander said, leaning back in his chair. Ethan forced a nod, keeping his face neutral. A brief silence stretched between them before Alexander's gaze drifted to the bookshelf behind him. A small, almost imperceptible sigh escaped his lips. Ethan had never seen him look so lost. "There was someone once," Alexander said suddenly. His voice was quiet, reflective. "A woman I loved." Ethan's body stiffened. He wasn't expecting that. The twist, a love that ended without warning. Alexander didn't look at him as he continued. "She was brilliant. Strong-willed. The kind of woman who could bring a man to his knees without even trying." A brief, humorless smile crossed his lips. And then one day, she was gone. No explanation. No goodbye. Ethan's chest tightened. He gripped the arms of his chair to steady himself. Alexander turned his sharp gaze back to Ethan. "I never understood why she left," he murmured. "But sometimes I wonder if she had a reason. If she was protecting something." His voice darkened. "If she was hiding something." Ethan's blood turned to ice. Was he talking about him? He forced himself to stay still, to keep breathing evenly. Then Alexander's next words nearly shattered his facade. "You remind me of her sometimes." Ethan's pulse spiked. He let out a short, controlled laugh. "I doubt that." Alexander didn't smile. He just studied Ethan for a long moment, something unreadable in his gaze. Ethan felt like he was standing on a thin, cracking sheet of ice. Then Alexander spoke again, his voice quiet, calculated. "What did you say your mother's name was again?" Ethan's throat closed. For a split second, his mind went blank. He had practiced his cover story 100 times. But under this scrutiny, under this suspicion, he almost forgot his own lie. His real identity was seconds away from slipping out. His father was looking at him now, really looking at him. Just as he was about to say something, a call came in. "Give me a moment." Ethan barely exhaled. He had escaped, but just barely. Ethan had been careful. Every lie, every half-truth, he had kept them airtight. But all it took was one mistake. It happened during a lunch break. Dave, one of the other interns, tossed Ethan's work ID onto the table. "Dude, you left this at reception," Dave said casually. Ethan grabbed it quickly, but his pulse froze as he saw the problem. His real name was printed on it. Ethan Carter. Not Ethan Brooks. Dave squinted. "Wait. Carter? I thought your last name was Brooks." Ethan's stomach twisted. He forced a smirk. "It's my middle name." He stuffed the ID into his pocket. "No big deal." Dave shrugged, but someone else had overheard the exchange. Alexander Grant. The CEO had been walking by and paused mid-step. He said nothing, just gave Ethan a long, unreadable look before disappearing into his office. Ethan exhaled, heart hammering. That evening, Ethan's name was called over the intercom. "Ethan Brooks, report to the CEO's office." Ethan wiped his sweaty palms on his pants as he walked into the intimidating office. Alexander sat behind his massive desk, flipping through a document. When he looked up, his piercing gaze locked onto Ethan's. "Close the door." Ethan obeyed, his throat dry. For a moment, there was silence. Then Alexander leaned forward. Why did you lie about your name? His tone was calm, too calm. Ethan tensed. I didn't lie. I used my mother's maiden name. That's not a crime, is it? Alexander tapped a pen against the desk. Why change your name at all? Ethan kept his expression neutral. Personal reasons. Alexander studied him. You were aware this company does thorough background checks, weren't you? Ethan nodded. And I passed, didn't I? A tense silence stretched between them. Then Alexander leaned back. I don't like deception, Ethan. Ethan clenched his jaw. I wasn't trying to deceive anyone. I worked hard. I earned my place here. Alexander didn't flinch. That may be true, but you've given me a reason to doubt you. He closed the file. You're fired. Ethan's heart dropped. Sir, this conversation is over. Ethan felt his chest tighten, but arguing wouldn't help. So he turned and walked out. Ethan barely made it out of the building before the weight of it all crashed down on him. Everything he had worked for gone. His mother's surgery, the financial security, the chance to prove himself. He had lost everything. By the time he reached the hospital, he felt like he could barely breathe. When he stepped into his mother's room, she immediately noticed something was wrong. She looked at him, concern in her eyes. Ethan. He tried to smile. Failed. I lost the job. Clara stiffened. What? Ethan swallowed hard. I got fired. His mother's lips parted in shock. But why? He hesitated. He had never told her the truth about who he was working for. She thought it was just some company, not Alexander Grant's. So he lied. There was an issue with my paperwork. They didn't like that I used your maiden name. His mother's face softened. Oh, sweetheart. Ethan couldn't meet her eyes. I'll find something else, he said quickly. I promise. But the words felt hollow. What if he couldn't? What if this was it? His mother reached for his hand. You don't have to do everything alone, Ethan. But he did. Ethan sat outside the hospital, his head in his hands. He had never felt so defeated. Getting fired was bad enough, but worse was facing his mother. Clara had always believed in him. He was her rock, the son who never let her down. And now? He had failed. His mother's condition was worsening. Stage 2 kidney failure. The doctors had been clear, without proper treatment, it would only get worse. She needed surgery. Dialysis. Time. But time cost money. And he had none. He clenched his fists, staring at the pavement. He felt helpless. And he hated it. Back at Grant Enterprises, Alexander sat in his office. Ethan's file opened before him. The name kept staring at him. Ethan Carter. Carter. A name that pulled him back 25 years. To a woman named Clara. She had vanished from his life without a trace. He had searched, but she was simply gone. Now, here was this young man, smart, fiery, familiar. Could it be? Alexander leaned back, his expression unreadable. There was one way to find out. He picked up the phone. Dig into Ethan Carter's background. I want to know everything. Ethan was working his shift when a man requested to speak with him. He sat at a corner, staring at the man across from him. His name was Vincent Drake, a high-powered lawyer for Titan Corp., Grant Enterprises' biggest rival. And he had an offer. You're in a tough spot, kid, Vincent said smoothly, sipping his coffee. No job, a sick mother, hospital bills piling up. Ethan's jaw tightened. What do you want? Vincent slid a folder across the table. Testify against Alexander Grant. Say he falsified numbers, engaged in unethical deals. That he fired you because you found out. Ethan's heart pounded. That's a lie. Vincent smirked. So? The truth doesn't matter, Ethan. Perception does. Ethan swallowed. And what do I get? Vincent leaned forward. $100,000. Ethan froze. 100,000. Enough for his mother's surgery. Enough to change everything. Vincent watched him, eyes gleaming. Think about it. He slid a business card across the table. When you're ready, call me. Then he left. Ethan stared at the card, his hands shaking. Revenge or redemption? Which path would he take? Ethan sat on the edge of his mother's hospital bed, staring at her frail frame. She was asleep, her breathing slow but steady. The machines beeped softly beside her. A constant reminder of how much time was slipping away. In his pocket, Vincent Drake's business card burned like a brand. $100,000. That money could give his mother a second chance. But at what cost? Betraying Alexander Grant? the man he had spent his whole life hating, but who, in the past few weeks, had shown himself to be more than just a ruthless billionaire. Ethan clenched his fists. If Alexander was a monster, destroying him would be easy. Determined to clear his head, Ethan left the hospital and took a walk. Without thinking, he found himself near Grant Enterprises. He shouldn't be here. But something pulled him back. His legs carried him to a familiar side entrance, the one interns used. The security guard barely glanced up. Ethan still had his badge. No one had deactivated it yet. On instinct, he slipped inside. Just one last look. Maybe then he could finally let go. He took the stairs 2 at a time, heading toward the records office. He had spent enough time here to know where the important files were kept. And that's when he saw it. A confidential document left open on a desk. The name Vincent Drake was all over it. Ethan's eyes scanned the contents. The rival company had a mole inside Grant Enterprises. Someone feeding them information. Ethan's breath caught. Someone close to Alexander was betraying him. And if Titan Corp succeeded, Grant Enterprises would collapse. Ethan stood there, heart pounding. He could walk away. Let Alexander suffer, take the money, and never look back. It would be easy. Except it wouldn't. Because Alexander didn't deserve this. And because Ethan wasn't the kind of man who could stand by and watch something wrong happen. For the first time in his life, revenge wasn't enough. He had a choice to make. And he made it. Alexander Grant's office was dark except for the glow of his desk lamp. The billionaire sat behind his desk, reviewing documents, when his door burst open. Ethan stood there, breathless. Alexander's expression hardened. I don't recall inviting you back here. Ethan stepped forward and slammed the document onto the desk. You're being set up, he said. There's a mole in your company. Alexander's eyes flicked to the document. He skimmed the pages, his jaw tightening. How did you get this? Ethan hesitated, then admitted, I never turned in my badge. Alexander looked up, his gaze unreadable. So, you came back to warn me? Ethan nodded. You don't deserve to lose everything over this. A long silence stretched between them. Then something shifted in Alexander's face, not anger, not suspicion, but respect. Sit down, Ethan, he said. We have a company to save. The conference room was silent. Alexander Grant sat at the head of the table, his fingers steepled under his chin. Ethan sat across from him, tension thrumming in his veins. The traitor was in this room. Ethan had spent the last 48 hours digging through financial records, internal emails, and security footage. And now he had proof. He took a deep breath and slid a folder across the table. Alexander opened it. His eyes darkened. The room collectively held its breath. Michael Harrington, a longtime executive. A man Alexander had trusted for over 20 years. Alexander's jaw clenched. Explain yourself. Michael scoffed. It's business, Alexander. You would have done the same. But there was something different in Alexander's expression. Ethan expected rage, fury. Instead, he saw something more devastating. Disappointment. After all these years, Alexander's voice was quiet but lethal. You sold me out to Titan Corporation. Michael smirked. And they were willing to pay me 3 times what you ever did. Ethan's hands curled into fists. People like Michael were exactly why he had never trusted the business world. Alexander leaned back, his expression unreadable. Then he pressed a button on the table. The door opened. 2 security guards stepped in. Escort Mr. Harrington out of my building, Alexander said coldly. Michael's smug expression crumbled. You can't be serious. I built this empire, Alexander cut him off. And I will not let a parasite like you destroy it. The guards grabbed Michael by the arms. He struggled, but it was useless. Ethan watched as the man was dragged out, his shouts echoing in the hallway. The traitor was gone. But the final battle wasn't over yet. Titan Corp had planned their attack well. With an insider feeding them information, they had been 1 step ahead of Grant Enterprises at every turn. But now? Now, Ethan and Alexander had the upper hand. Ethan sat beside Alexander as they strategized. We need to cut Titan off before they can strike again, Ethan said. Their lawsuit is built on manipulated data. Alexander nodded. And if we expose that? They collapse. It was risky. A counterattack this aggressive could either save Grant Enterprises or sink it forever. Alexander turned to Ethan. You're sure about this? Ethan met his gaze. 100%. For a long moment, Alexander studied him. Then he smirked. You remind me of myself when I was younger. Ethan snorted. That's not exactly a compliment. Alexander chuckled. No. But it means you're ready. For the first time, Ethan felt something strange. Trust. Not just in himself, but in Alexander. The next day, Alexander Grant stood in front of the entire board. Ethan watched from the sidelines as his father defended everything he had built. Not with money, not with power, but with conviction. And as the board members nodded in agreement as they chose to stand with Alexander instead of jumping ship, Ethan felt something shift. This wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about legacy. And maybe, just maybe, it was about family. With Titan Corp defeated and Michael gone, Grant Enterprises was stronger than ever. But as Ethan stood next to Alexander watching the skyline from the office balcony, he knew one thing for certain. Their fight wasn't over. Because now, it wasn't just about saving the empire. It was about saving themselves. Alexander Grant sat in his private office, his fingers tightening around the crisp pages of the report. His investigator had just left, but his mind was still spinning. The name on the file burned into his memory. Clara Carter. A name he hadn't spoken in nearly 24 years. A name that still carried the weight of unanswered questions, unfinished stories, and a love lost too soon. He had spent years searching for her, only to come up empty. Now, after all this time, she was here, in this very city. But that wasn't what shattered his world. It was the second name on the report. Ethan Carter. His pulse thundered. His eyes trailed down the document, scanning through the details, the birth certificate, the records. And then it hit him. Ethan Brooks was his son. The same Ethan Brooks he had mentored, challenged, and fired. His breath came short. A memory flashed in his mind. What do you want from this company, Ethan Brooks? I want to learn from the best. But that hadn't been the truth, had it? Ethan had come into his life for revenge. And yet he had saved him. Even when the opportunity for payback had presented itself, Ethan had chosen to warn him about the traitor in the company. If he had wanted to ruin him, he had the perfect chance. But he didn't. Why? The realization struck Alexander like a bolt of lightning. Because Ethan didn't just hate him. He wanted answers. He wanted to know why he had been left behind. Alexander let out a slow, shaky breath, running a hand through his graying hair. My son. My own flesh and blood, and I didn't even recognize him. No wonder there had been something familiar about the boy. His fire. His determination. That stubborn streak that reminded him so much of Clara. He swallowed the lump in his throat, his gaze darkening. How had this happened? Why had she left? Why had she never told him? And most importantly, why had she kept his son away from him? Alexander didn't hesitate. He grabbed his coat and strode out of the office, his voice firm as he barked orders to his assistant. Call the driver. Get me to St. Christopher's Hospital. Now. Ethan sat in the dimly lit hospital room, exhaustion settling deep in his bones. His mother's shallow breaths filled the silence. He had done everything he could, but it still wasn't enough. Then, the door swung open. Ethan's head snapped up. His stomach dropped. Alexander Grant stood at the entrance. The powerful billionaire, always composed, always unreadable, but not now. His sharp gaze locked onto Ethan. Not with anger, not with judgment, but with something even more dangerous. Recognition. A silence stretched between them, thick with tension. Ethan's jaw clenched. What are you doing here? Alexander didn't answer immediately. His eyes flickered to Clara, who lay frail on the hospital bed. His expression softened. For a moment, he wasn't the ruthless CEO. He was just a man seeing the woman he lost. Clara. Her eyelids fluttered open at the familiar voice. Her breath hitched. Hey, Alexander? Ethan's stomach churned as he watched his mother's eyes widen in shock. Something wasn't right. She didn't look angry. She looked guilty. Alexander took a step forward. His voice was raw, unsteady. You left, he whispered. I searched for you. He exhaled sharply, shaking his head. I never knew about him. His gaze shifted back to Ethan, pain flashing in his eyes. I never knew about our son. Ethan flinched, his throat tightening. Our son. For so long, he had imagined this moment. The confrontation. The look of betrayal on Alexander's face when he finally discovered the truth. But instead of rage, there was regret. Deep, unshaken regret. Ethan wasn't ready for that. He shot to his feet. So what, now you care? Now that you've discovered me, his voice cracked, raw with years of resentment. Where the hell were you all this time? Alexander's jaw tightened. I would have been there, Ethan. If I had known, Ethan scoffed. Yeah? Well, you didn't. And we survived without you. Alexander didn't back down. And yet, you came to work for me. His gaze was sharp, searching. Why? Ethan's chest ached. Because he had needed money. Because he had been desperate. Because some part of him had wanted revenge. But another part had wanted to know if you were worth hating. He didn't answer. Alexander exhaled slowly. His next words came softer. You could have destroyed me, Ethan. You had every chance to take your revenge. But you didn't. Ethan's hands curled into fists. I didn't do it for you. Alexander didn't flinch. Then why? Ethan's throat tightened. He didn't have an answer. Or maybe he just didn't want to say it. The room fell into silence. Then Clara spoke. "I left," she whispered, her voice barely above her breath. Both men turned toward her. Tears welled in her eyes. "Alexander, you never abandoned us." She swallowed hard. "I left you." Alexander took a sharp step forward, his voice raw. "Why?" Clara turned to Ethan, her face full of sorrow. "I thought I was protecting you." Ethan's world tilted. Everything he had believed, every resentment, every sleepless night spent cursing Alexander's name. Alexander took a slow breath, his gaze shifting from Clara to Ethan. The air in the hospital room was thick with unspoken words, emotions neither of them were ready to face. Now wasn't the time. He turned to Clara, his voice quiet but firm. "I searched for you. For years." A tear slipped down her cheek, but he didn't press further. Instead, he looked at Ethan, the son he had unknowingly abandoned. The young man who had every reason to hate him. And yet Ethan had saved him. He wasn't here for revenge. Not really. He had come looking for something deeper. Truth. Clarity. A past that had been stolen from him. The silence between them stretched, heavy and uncertain. Then, a knock at the door. A doctor stepped in, clipboard in hand. "Good news. The surgery is scheduled for tomorrow morning." Ethan's head snapped up. His mother's breath hitched. Alexander simply nodded. "Everything has been arranged." Ethan turned to him, stunned. "What?" Alexander met his gaze. "I made a few calls." His voice was calm, unwavering. "Don't worry about the surgery anymore." Ethan's mind reeled. The surgery. The thing he had been working so hard for, struggling to afford. Alexander had handled it without hesitation. His chest tightened. He should feel relieved. He should be grateful. Instead, he felt like the ground beneath him had shifted. He had spent years resenting this man, telling himself that Alexander Grant was a ruthless, heartless billionaire who abandoned them without a second thought. But now that belief was unraveling. The next evening after the surgery, Ethan stood outside the hospital, staring blankly at the city skyline. Then he heard footsteps. "Alexander." For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Alexander exhaled and broke the silence. "I know I can't undo the past." Ethan's jaw tightened. "But I don't want to lose you again." Ethan swallowed hard. "You never had me to begin with." Alexander flinched, but he nodded. "Fair enough." Another pause. Then, "I want to offer you a position at Grant Enterprises." Ethan frowned. "As what?" Another intern. Alexander's lips twitched slightly. "No. As my son." Ethan's breath stalled. This wasn't just a job offer. It was something more. A chance. A beginning. A test. Alexander searched his face. "I know you don't trust me." His voice was quieter now. "But if you ever want to know the man I really am, if you ever want to try to be part of something bigger, the door is open." Ethan couldn't speak. He had spent his whole life believing he was unwanted. Now, the man he had spent years hating was offering him a place by his side. But could he take it? Could he forgive? His fists clenched. His heart wavered. And then, Ethan takes a deep breath but doesn't answer. Ethan sat by his mother's hospital bed, watching the slow, steady rise and fall of her chest. The surgery had been successful. She had made it. For the first time in years, his chest felt a little lighter. His mother stirred, her eyes fluttering open. When she saw him, she gave a tired but relieved smile. "You stayed." Ethan exhaled a shaky breath, gripping her hand. "Of course I did." She squeezed his fingers gently. "I'm proud of you, Ethan. No matter what happens next." His throat tightened. No matter what happens next. That evening, Alexander and Clara stood on the hospital rooftop, the city lights sprawling behind them. A deep silence stretched between them. Finally, Clara spoke. "You looked for me?" Her voice was barely above a whisper. Alexander turned to her, his expression unreadable. "Of course I did." Clara swallowed hard. "Then why didn't you find me?" Alexander's jaw clenched. "Because I was searching for a woman who didn't want to be found." Tears burned her eyes. "You don't understand, Then make me understand." His voice wasn't cold. It was desperate. Pained. Clara closed her eyes, then whispered, "I was protecting him." Alexander inhaled sharply. "I was young. Scared. And when I found out I was pregnant, I thought you would never choose me over your family's expectations. I didn't want Ethan to grow up being someone's secret." Alexander ran a hand over his face. "Damn it, Clara. I would have fought for you." Clara's voice broke. "But I didn't know that." The weight of the past settled between them, raw and heavy. Then Alexander did something unexpected. He reached out. Not with anger. Not with blame. But with understanding. His fingers brushed against hers. "I lost you once," he whispered, voice thick. "I won't lose you again." Clara choked back a sob. And for the first time in years, she let herself lean into him. Later that night, Alexander found Ethan sitting outside the hospital. He sat beside him, silent for a long moment. Then, "This is only the beginning," Alexander said softly. Ethan turned to him, skeptical. "Of what?" Alexander met his gaze. "Of fixing what was broken." Ethan let out a breath. "You can't fix the past." "No," Alexander agreed. "But I can be here now. If you let me." Ethan studied him. For once, he saw not the ruthless billionaire, but a man who had also been lost. A man who had also been searching for something. Ethan swallowed hard. Then finally he nodded. Not an acceptance. Not yet. But a start. As they sat together, watching the city breathe, Ethan's mother's words echoed in his mind. "Sometimes, the people we think betrayed us were only trying to protect us. Maybe, just maybe, it was time to stop running." Ethan exhaled, feeling lighter than he had in years. He was finally home. Please like, comment, and subscribe.